Hello and welcome to this workshop on Bach's example. Many of you know that during the pandemic I was completing a project of mine. It was a lifelong project to learn and perform in public all of the organ works of Johann Sebastian Bach. The pandemic got in the way of the public performance part of that project. And I'll be working on completing that now that we're back in performing for each other in public. But I did complete the learning part. And because of the pandemic, much of that learning was done here at my home. I have a small pipe organ for practice, and I'm very, very grateful for that always, but especially during the pandemic. And as I was completing the project, none other than Bach was looking over me. Bach, of course, left us many musical examples to follow. Examples that teach us how to play for worship, how to encourage congregational singing, how to improvise, how to compose, how to make music in collaborative situations, how to interpret music, not only his own scores, but those of his contemporaries. But beyond that, Bach's life itself can be a model for us to follow. For he was a real living human being. He had joys and sorrows as we do. He had frustrations as we do. He had moments of discernment and of creativity as we can. And so I hope in this short workshop just to touch on a few of those things and to whet your appetite so that you can investigate further into Bach's example for your own inspiration and growth. Let's begin with just a bit about Bach's life. Much of this will be review for you, but some of it might be surprising, as it was to me. Bach was born into a family of musicians. In fact, the name Bach, the family name, was kind of synonymous with music making in his time and in the generations both preceding his and following his. But Bach was orphaned by age 10. Both his mother and father died, and Bach was sent to live with his older brother. And so that older brother was responsible for the young Johann's education and inspiration and discipline. And so young Bach learned from his older brother, learned the art of harpsichord playing. The older brother had been a student of Kraybill, and he learned other things that a young man of his time needed to know. At age 15, he was obligated to make his own living, make his own way in the world, and so he successfully auditioned for a spot as a boy chorister, and he was hired at St. Michael's Church in Lüneburg, about 150 miles to the north. Soon after he arrived, however, his voice changed, and all of a sudden he was no longer qualified for the role that he had successfully obtained for himself. But luckily, his training earlier, under the tutelage of his brother, had included violin playing lessons. And so he found a role as a violinist in the church instead. When Bach was 18, he achieved his first role as an organist in Arnstadt, which was not that far from the city of his birth. But Bach was a lifelong learner. And one of his mentors, or a person that he revered and wanted to be a mentor, was Dietrich Buxtehude. And it's recorded that the young Bach asked for a 4-week leave of absence from his church position so that he could go north, 225 miles north, walking most of that journey, to meet and learn from the great Buxtehude. Unfortunately, Johann Sebastian became so enamored with what he was doing there that he stayed for 4 months instead of 4 weeks. He was welcomed back, but under strict guidance. And part of that guidance was, please don't be so flowery in your introduction of hymns. You're confusing the congregation. Your music is getting too complex at a time when Bach was investigating complexity as honoring God, as entering into the mystery of the divine. Bach soon moved on to a larger church in Mühlhausen, but he brought his same baggage with him and did have a few conflicts with the church hierarchy there. And in 1708, at age 23, he received his first secular appointment, although the division between sacred and secular in his time was much different than in ours. He was appointed as a court organist for the Grand Duke of Weimar. And as court organist, he was responsible for the entertainment but also the theological enlightenment of the court. He served there for 10 years, and during that time, he wrote the majority of his organ works, and he became known as the greatest organist and composer for organ in all of Germany. However, in the court, he was denied a promotion to Kapellmeister, the top musician of the court. And soon he moved on to another court, that of Prince Leopold of Cöthen. And he continued to finally hone his skills as a composer and a performer and a director of instrumental chamber music. And it was during this time that Bach invited and encouraged and learned from the styles of composers outside of Germany. Bach himself never traveled beyond the borders of his native country, but because he served a court, there were often travelers that came in and out of the court from other countries. And the musicians themselves traveled. Many musicians of other nations were attracted to this very prosperous court. And so Bach learned, usually through the scores that came with those musicians, he learned about the music of other composers. What you're listening to right now is Bach's transcription for organ of a violin concerto by Antonio Vivaldi, the Italian composer who was every bit as famous as Bach was in his own country. But still, he was struggling a bit. It wasn't quite the right fit for him yet. And finally, he moved to his final position in the city of Leipzig. Actually, that was a combination of many positions. And don't we church organists know about combinations of positions? There he composed and performed and taught for his remaining 27 years on this earth. And he didn't only teach music, he also taught Latin and catechism. He was responsible for the music of the 3 largest churches of Leipzig. And his output as a composer of that time was nothing less than enormous. He composed a new cantata almost every week. And he composed also during that time his great passions and oratorios and magnificats. Because Leipzig was also the hometown of Martin Luther, generations before Bach. And Johann Sebastian Bach had much in common with Luther. He had a philosophical and religious bond with Luther, but he also had this common national and regional heritage. Bach attended the same school Luther did in the first 10 years of his life before he was orphaned. And his further schooling was within curricula that were very much influenced by the writings and teachings of Luther. And Luther placed music in very high regard. This is what Luther said about music, quote, "Music is an outstanding gift of God and next to theology. I would not want to give up my slight knowledge of music for a great consideration. And youth should be taught this art, for it makes for fine, skillful people." End quote. So I would like for us to look at 2 volumes within Bach's great output for the organ. These are 2 volumes that are religious in their intent, but that mix of sacred and secular still exists. And they're 2 volumes that Bach intended to teach us many things about being church musicians, but also about living life on this earth. The first of those is Orgelbuchlein, or Little Organ Book. And then the second volume that I'd like to look at is from much later in Bach's career. It's Klavierübung, Part 3. Klavierübung means keyboard practice. And although Bach has a lot to say about how we should teach and how we should practice, this volume isn't about teaching how to play, as it's teaching how to live a godly life. So think of keyboard practice more in the line of the practice of music, like the practice of law or the practice of medicine. This is instruction via his compositions in how to do our art well. Paul Westermeyer has said that this is, quote, a summary of life before God, end quote. So our first example is from Orgelbuchlein, Bach catalog number 622. In German, it is O Mensch, bewein dein Sünde groß. And decades after Bach lived, the great French composer Charles-Marie Widor, the composer of the famous Toccata, said this about it, quote, the finest piece of instrumental music ever written, end quote. Here's the literal English translation of the text of stanza 1 of the hymn that inspired this piece. O humankind, weep for your great sins, because of which Christ left his Father's bosom and came upon the earth. From a young woman, pure and gentle, he was born here for us. He wanted to become our mediator. To the dead he gave life, and removed in this way all sickness, until the time came when he was sacrificed for us, bore the heavy burden of our sins for a long time on the cross. And so here you hear Bach interpret that text musically. You hear heavy sighs, the grief that the hymn tells us to bemoan. This short setting includes the largest harmonic vocabulary of any of the Orgelbuchlein chorales. A more upbeat piece in every sense of that word, also from Orgelbuchlein, is Erstanden ist der heilige Christ, BWV number 628. This is based on an Easter hymn, and that hymn inspired our Christ the Lord is risen today. So how does Bach musically depict those joyous concepts? Robert Marshall, Bach scholar, says, quote, the chorale text, silent but implied by the traditional melody, is presented simultaneously with its exegesis by the counter voices, end quote. So here you see resurrection ascending 2-octave sequences in eighth notes from the beginning of the piece throughout the entire piece. And you'll see another voice also ascending in quarter notes. And the pedals ascend 9 times, but they also descend on this text, quote, the Comforter of all the world. And now on to Klavierübung Part 3. On its title page, Bach gives us the only indication we have as to his intent for publishing this work. In English, the translation reads, third part of the keyboard practice, consisting of various preludes on the Catechism and other hymns for the organ, prepared for music lovers and particularly for connoisseurs of such work, for the recreation of the spirit, by Johann Sebastian Bach, Royal Polish and Electoral Saxon court composer, Kapellmeister, and director of the Chorus Musicus, Leipzig, published by the author. So, that's a high and lofty thing, to prepare something for music lovers, for players, for composers, for connoisseurs of such art, for the recreation of the spirit. Let's see what we can learn from Bach. Bach was 38 when he came to Leipzig, and he was 54 when Klavierübung 3 was published. He was probably contemplating his own legacy of his time on this earth. Several of his sons were starting to be successful on their own as musicians. Classical styles were becoming popular, and he was suffering under the criticism of his contemporary, Johann Adolf Scheibe, who wrote in 1737 that Bach, quote, would be the admiration of whole nations if he were more agreeable, if he did not take away the natural elements in his pieces by giving them a turgid and confused style, and if he did not darken their beauty by an excess of art, end quote. I would say that social media doesn't have a lot to say compared to that. Klavierübung 3 has an interesting structure. 3 is a numerological symbol of the Trinity. And then the number of pieces in all of Klavierübung 3 totals 27. What is 27? 3 times 3 times 3. So the ultimate suggestion of the Trinity in this organization. So let's look at one of the settings of the Allein Gott. There are 3 settings of this hymn in Klavierübung 3. And it turns out that this hymn is the most set hymn by Johann Sebastian Bach. There are many, many, many examples of his setting of this hymn. It makes for an interesting study because normally we would think of Glory to God in the Highest as being a very upbeat kind of hymn to sing, and it is in some of Bach's settings. But some of his settings are quite meditative in character. I encourage you to take a look at many of them. The one we're looking at here is the trio setting, the middle setting of the 3 in Klavierübung 3. So 3 voices, one for right hand, one for left hand, one for pedals, all based on a hymn tune. But this setting could have gotten some criticism from Bach's religious authorities because it is quite complex. I find it though to also be quite joyous, and it's kind of like a treasure hunt to try to find the hymn tune in amongst all of the joy. Next, we'll look at both settings of the 10 Commandments chorale. Bach would have known it as Dies sind die heiligen 10 Gebot, or These are the holy 10 Commandments. So this is a hymn all about the 10 Commandments and how we should follow them. And it's interesting how Bach illustrates that musically. In the first of the 2 settings, Bach illustrates that we should exactly follow the 10 Commandments by using the strictest form of counterpoint, the canon. Whatever the leader voice sings, the follower voice has to exactly follow. So Bach includes a canon, but not just a canon. So he starts with accompaniment figures in my right hand and pedal. The hymn tune then enters later, and it enters in canon. One at the bottom of my left hand, one at the top of my left hand, an octave apart. And yes, the follower exactly follows the leader, just like we should do for the Ten Commandments. In the second of the two settings of the Ten Commandments chorale, the one for manuals alone, Bach illustrates the joy that can come from the Christian life. So following the Ten Commandments doesn't have to be drudgery. It can lead to a closer connection with the divine. It can lead to more joy. And Bach illustrates that joy in two ways. The first, this is a jig, this is a joyous dance. And the second, he plays around with the number 10 in so many joyous and inventive ways, you'll be amazed. This piece is only 2 pages long, but in it, Bach illustrates that concept of 10. The first way he does it is to extend an idea that he got from the melody of the hymn. The melody starts with repeated notes, and Bach extends those repeated notes so that you have 10 of them. But he also pays homage to Luther, because those 10 are divided, 2 of them are separated from the other 8, because that's exactly how this hymn by Luther divides the Ten Commandments. So in Luther's hymn, the first stanza is about the concept of the Ten Commandments. Then stanzas 2 through 9 address commandments 1 through 8. And then stanza 10 addresses the last 2 commandments. So here's Bach paying homage to Luther. But Bach doesn't leave 10 there. He also illustrates it in other amazing ways. So I told you the first 10 repeated notes are interrupted by a leap. Well, those leaps get wider and wider, and they're more and more angular. This is a really weird fugue subject with all those repetitions and then these jumps higher and higher. And you wonder why until you count the half steps between the lowest note of that fugue subject and the highest. And you find that there are 10 half steps between lowest and highest. And that's not all. The fugue subject is 10 beats long, and the fugue subject occurs 10 times within this piece. So in only 2 pages, Bach gives us so much joy and so much numerology and so much illustration of a godly life. So one never knows when you're reading too much into the music of Bach. And also one never knows if you're missing something. That's the great thing about delving deeply into the works of Bach, as I have during the pandemic. So here's a possibility that was raised by a Bach scholar. J plus S plus B plus A plus C plus H in the German alphabet equals 14. So Bach identified that and its inverse, 41, as his musical signature in numerology. And at a very important point in this piece, the number 14 becomes evident, if not obvious. So I told you that Luther divided the commandments into 8 plus 2. So there are 8 statements of the fugue theme in this setting. And then there's a gap of 14 measures. And then the final 2 statements happen. It's as if Bach was placing himself with us in the midst of the 10 Commandments. This next piece looks kind of strange and sounds kind of strange until you notice the symbolism. It's a piece based on a hymn that talks about the baptism of Jesus Christ in the Jordan. In Bach's time, the hymn would have been known as Christ unser Herr zum Jordan kam, or Christ our Lord came to the Jordan. And Bach illustrates what happens there in Christ's life with several things. One is, you'll notice a kind of wave pattern in my left hand, representing the water of the river. The hymn tune is in my feet. The right hand has these very angular motifs that Bach intends to symbolize crosses. And at the very end of this hymn, that water comes up to a high pitch that overcomes the melody of the chorale that was in the pedals, and Christ is baptized. The next hymn setting is a cry to God. How many of us have wailed to God during this pandemic? This hymn is Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir. Out of deep distress I cry to thee, Lord. This is Bach at his most complex, as if saying the human condition is this complex. And this piece was fascinating to me from the very start, and difficult because it is a 6-voice fugue. It contains 2 voices for my pedals and 4 voices for my hands. It's very difficult to play. Fascinated with it when I heard something that told me about the human brain and human comprehension of sound. It turns out that when we hear sound, for instance, put yourself in a busy restaurant and you're talking to one person and you're trying to pay attention to the conversation at the next table that you're eavesdropping, and it's really difficult to try to keep both of those straight in your head. Now add another conversation and another. Well, that's difficult. If it's easier sounds, and especially if those sounds go together, it turns out that the human brain can comprehend pretty well 4 separate sounds. And this scientist on this podcast was saying that that's why music, choral music, evolved to include basically 4 voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Now, of course, we know we can have more and less, but it was this scientist's theory that we can really comprehend only 4 distinct sounds before things start just sounding like masses of sound or walls of sound or huge chords. We can comprehend 4 sounds. Bach writes a fugue in 6 voices, as if to say that he's writing a cry that only God can comprehend. And finally, we get to the grand summation, the E-flat fugue, also known as the Saint Anne fugue, because the subject sounds like the hymn tune Saint Anne, or the tune that we sing, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. It's a hymn tune that has become very important to me during the pandemic and for my life. I play this fugue often for funerals because I think it illustrates both the help and the hope of God. Musically, Bach gives us a fugue in E-flat major. How many flats does the key of E-flat major have? 3. There's the Trinity again. But Bach doesn't stop there. He gives us a triple fugue, a fugue with 3 sections, a fugue that also illustrates J.S. Bach and Johann Sebastian Bach, the main theme, which goes B flat, G, C, B flat, E, E, D, E flat. If you spell that in the German musical alphabet and you assign numbers to pitches, that's J.S. Bach. I think Bach musically signed the last piece of Klavierübung 3. Of course, I can't prove that, but just knowing Bach, I think that would be like him. That main theme appears 27 times. 3 times 3 times 3. And even the time signatures of the 3 different parts of this triple fugue, 2/4, 6/4, and 12/8, are proportional to each other. So it sums up Klavierübung 3, which is itself a summary of Bach's work, both musical and non-musical, in his time on our earth. It's a summary of Baroque composition and Lutheran faith, to the organ as an instrument of praise, as an instrument worthy of the highest praise to God. It's a summary of Bach's legacy, and it's an example for us. The Bach scholar Christoph Wolff says, quote, "With this kaleidoscope of keyboard music, Bach composed nothing short of a memorial to his own artistry." So what does Bach have to teach us? I think there's a lot. And I think we need not to relegate him to either a place of reverence on a pedestal somewhere or of past, but of current relevance to our faith and our lives and how we behave as worship musicians. Here are some of the things that I have learned from Bach that I hope inspire you as well. 1, choose the best that is possible in yourself, for your goals, for your tasks, for your time. 2, choose that which ennobles the mind and the spirit. Bach said that his Klavierübung 3 was for the recreation of the spirit. Choose that which gives your spirit recreation. Another thing I think we can learn from Bach is that all art communicates beyond words, maybe even beyond thoughts. And all art, even if it appears to be secular, can be offered in praise to God, to lift spirits and feed souls of everyone who performs it and hears it. And that we are co-creators with God, that the creative spirit that lived within Johann Sebastian Bach also lives within us, and that it is a joy to release that spirit. And that we should rejoice in the creations of others. Remember that organ transcription of the Vivaldi violin concerto that you heard earlier. And that we can expound on others' creations. Bach himself wrote very few chorale melodies or hymns, but he did write countless settings of hymns by others and harmonizations of hymns that still appear in our hymnals today. And that we should not be afraid to revisit and revise pieces. That G major prelude that I played for you earlier, that was revised by Bach several times during his career. And it's beautiful in its perfection because Bach did revise it. When we play, we are co-creators with Johann Sebastian Bach and with God. And we should revel in that, and we should treasure it, and we should find great joy in sharing the music that we create. I hope that you will take the example of Johann Sebastian Bach and make it your own. I think he has a lot to teach us.